Howdy folks, hope you're all having a good one, and welcome back to World of Tanks with the mighty Jingles, where today, here on the Ghost Town map in a Tier 9 battle, Dow Joe is going to be having the fight of his life in the Swedish premium Tier 8 tank destroyer. Yes, I know Sweden, I'll cover that in a moment. The premium Tier 8 Swedish tank destroyer, the S1, which is basically a Tier 8 version of the Tier 9 and 10 prototype and production Swedish S-tank. And yes, the Swedes get very upset if you call this thing a tank destroyer. Not a tank destroyer, it's a tank. Although, you know, on a couple of different levels the Swedes may have a point, because while we all think of a tank as something with a turret and a turret basket and a turret ring and a gun in the turret, and this thing definitely doesn't have any of that. I mean, the gun in this thing doesn't even move. It's fixed in the hull. You aim the gun by moving the tank. But the whole idea of what is a tank destroyer is a bit nebulous as well, because technically a tank destroyer isn't a vehicle, it's a role. 57mm 6-pounder towed anti-tank guns were organised in the US Army at least into tank destroyer battalions in World War II, and a 57mm gun is not even an armoured vehicle, let alone a tank, but it is a tank destroyer. So if the Swedes want to call this thing a tank, fine, who cares? It was ideally suited for the defensive role that the Swedish army needed though, because they predominantly expected themselves to be having to defend against an armoured invasion from the east. Coincidentally enough, in almost exactly the same way that Dow Joe is having to do here. Although the armoured opponents attacking him from the east are not hordes of T-55s and T-62s, but there is a Russian amongst them. And this machine is ideally suited to the defensive role. Well, maybe not this machine, but the machines that were developed from it. The actual S-tank. Because the front of this thing is basically an automatic ricochet angle. Or it would be in World of Tanks if there was any actual armour on it. This is the S1's biggest problem. And it's a problem with the S-tank at Tier 10 as well. The S103 at Tier 9. But it's a bigger problem at Tier 8 in this premium, because it only has 30mm of armour. The S103 at Tier 9 only has 40mm of armour, although it does have a couple of strips of 50mm of armour as well, but you'd have to be extraordinarily unlucky to hit the 50mm armour strips. Most of the upper glacis on the Tier 10 S-tank is actually 50mm thick, and you're probably thinking, if you're not familiar with how the Overmatch mechanics work in World of Tanks, that 50mm of armour is nothing. There are Tier 1 tanks that can penetrate that, yes they can, but not at extreme angles, because of how ricochets work. And just look at the front of this thing, look at that extreme angle. Anything that hits that's going to ricochet clean off, right? Well, no, not in World of Tanks. And it's all because of Overmatch, and we'll come on to that in a moment. For now, the initial flanking manoeuvre defeated, Dow Joe and the Backchat 12T, who I have to say is being a good scout here, are pushing around to occupy the positions occupied by the T-30 and the SU-130 in order to try to get some flanking shots on the enemy team. So what's Overmatch? Well, Overmatch is all to do with the thickness of the armour that you're shooting at and the calibre of the gun that you're shooting at it with. So because the S-tank at Tier 10 and the S103 at Tier 9 have 40 or in places 50mm of armour, in order to completely overmatch that armour, you have to be hitting it with a gun that has a calibre of at least 120mm in order to overmatch the 40mm armour, or 150mm in order to overmatch the 50mm armour. And while there are plenty of 120mm and higher guns around in World of Tanks at Tier 9 and 10, there are not that many 150mm guns or higher. And if you can't overmatch armour angled at an extremity like that, it's just going to ricochet. The problem for this machine at Tier 8 is that it only has 30mm of armour. And that means it can be overmatched by guns with a calibre of 90mm or higher. And what the overmatch thing actually means in practice is that no ricochet check is made. It just penetrates the armour. And a machine like this, that relies on ricochets for staying alive, because it doesn't actually have any armour, that is a really big problem. The Stridswagen S1 just cannot afford to get shot at by anything because it's going to struggle to find a tank that doesn't have a gun big enough to overmatch its own. So it has to rely on stealth. Now fortunately, Dow Joe has been able to do that this far, and that Batchat 12T over there has been doing a reasonably good job of spotting targets for him, although he has required a bit of encouragement. But hey, he's up for it. And this is the ideal situation when you're in as badly armoured a tank destroyer as this, because you can't really afford to go out looking for your own targets, or you'll get shot at, and you'll die. The other weird thing about these Swedish machines is the way the gun is aimed, because, well, the gunner doesn't actually have any control over the gun itself other than deciding when to fire it, because the gun is fixed in the hull. You aim the gun by moving the tank, and it's the gunner who does it, not the driver. But essentially, once this tank arrives in a firing position, the driver takes his hands off the controls. Control of the tank is then switched over to the gunner, and the gunner, using his aiming system, actually moves the tank around on the suspension in order to get the gun sight on whatever it is the tank commander wants him to shoot at. It's actually a really, really clever system. And it's simulated here in World of Tanks by what they call siege mode, which is what Dow Joe has just activated. He's now in siege mode. He's able to turn the tank on its suspension in order to get the gun aimed. But there's nothing to actually shoot at, so he deactivates siege mode and relinquishes control back to the driver, and now it becomes a highly mobile machine. But you can't aim for shit in this mode. And that's the trade-off. Because when you go into siege mode, you can actually aim the gun, but you're restricted to a speed of 10 kilometers per hour, and you turn really slowly. Oh, also, this thing has god-awful gun depression. Because technically it has 0 gun depression. You don't depress the gun, you depress the tank on its suspension. That's how this thing works. Unfortunately, there's now just Dow Joe and that Batchat left against 6 enemies. And he can't afford to take a hit from anything with a gun caliber 90mm or higher, because it'll just overmatch his armour. The good news is this is not a terrible situation. I mean, because if you are in a machine like this, and you have to fight off a whole bunch of enemies who don't want the cap and want to kill all, and you have a light tank to scout them for you, well, this is as good as it's ever going to get. You just have to actually penetrate the targets. And hope that they all come at you one at a time. So, spot the tank maybe? Batchat? And it was all going so well. Oh, there he is. Oh, the enemy ELC's up. The Batchat should be able to handle him. He's going to have to handle him while Dow Joe focuses on the IS-6B. And he has killed the ELC, but the ELC spotted him, and the IS-6 is now, well, he's shooting at the target that he can actually see, which is the Batchat. The Batchat knows what's good for him, so he's getting the hell out of there, while Dow Joe continues to work over this IS-6. And note how Dow is pulling back from the bush that's providing concealment, because if he's in the bush and he fires, it won't provide concealment anymore. Unfortunately, the 4 surviving enemy tanks are no longer content to come at him one at a time. The Batchat is taking a lot of heat there, but is doing a pretty good job keeping them all distracted and ensuring that Dow has something to shoot at. But the Batchat just got immobilised because he's a Batchat, he's not an EBR, and blown the wheels off those things only slows them down by 5 kilometers per hour, and so he is now dead. And it's Dow against 4 enemies. And they've got a pretty good idea of where he is. And now it's Dow against 3 enemies, and he's still working the bushes. Pops up to the bush in order to look through it, and pulls back in order to shoot through it without actually being seen. But they all know exactly where he is. They just can't see him. Yet. Fortunately, because he's basically facing a bunch of heavies, while this gun doesn't have a fantastic rate of fire, it does have amazing penetration. 288mm with the stock ammo, which is APCR. But he's gonna get spotted now. Yeah, there it is. The AE Phase 1 has a 120mm gun. Remember, this thing will be overmatched by anything with a 90mm gun or higher, and somehow the AE manages to find the tiny strip on the front of this thing that can actually ricochet a shell of that caliber. But he doesn't find it twice, and now it's just a question of who's going to get to shoot first. Less than 6 shots per minute out of this thing. Dow's really feeling that reload now, but he's got him. Here comes the Lurver. He's a one-shot too, unfortunately. The Lurver has a 105mm gun, and Dow is a one-shot as well. So, that was a bit of a heartbreaker. One more shot would have won him the match. That was an ace tanker on a defeat, along with a whole bunch of other awards, including the Radley Walters Medal. And just to rub salt into the wounds, he did more than 9,000 damage, destroyed 3/4 of the entire enemy team by himself. He wasn't even top tier, and he ended up getting finished off by a tank that only did 490 damage the entire game. I'm sorry, I shouldn't be laughing. My commiserations, Dow Joe. I think we can all agree that you probably didn't deserve to lose that one. But if nothing else, it proves once again, as if any further proof were needed, that if you can't take a joke, you shouldn't be playing World of Tanks. My commiserations, and as always, take care, stay safe, and I'll catch you next time.